Hey Rebels, did you know Saskatchewan is home to some of the most coveted barley in the world? Brewers come from across North America to get their hands on what Saskatchewan farmers are growing. The fact is, when it comes to barley for beer, our farmers are a pretty big deal. In 2019 alone, Saskatchewan farmers produced 9.9 million metric tons of barley, which is roughly equivalent to 900,000 city buses. Barley in Saskatchewan is a big deal. We also have a small army of crop scientists developing crops and technology to produce barley that is more resistant to disease and pests and better suited to brewing craft beer. Dr. Beattie is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan with the Barley and Oat Breeding Program. He's one of the scientists that are the unsung heroes of craft beer. These guys are part of our agricultural heritage as a province, and they're essential to the economic growth of our province and sustainability in the future. These guys are the reason we get to say Saskatchewan grows the best barley in the world, and it only makes sense to brew kick-ass beer with it. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Right on. Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
How's it going?
Yeah, good. It's good to be in Regina again.
Big long drive?
Yeah, I took a roundabout way through Calgary to get here, but yeah.
Back when I saw you a few months ago on Rostern, I was like, oh man, this guy has so much knowledge in his head. I want to get it out on the show.
Right on. Yeah, it's good to hear people interested because, sometimes we get locked away from the public and we don't get a chance to tell our stories there.
So tell me, what is the Barley and Oats breeding program?
Well, this is it's a plant breeding program, and it's been part of the university for just probably over 100 years now. When the university got started back in the early 1900s, it had plant breeding programs. Back in that day, one person looked after quite a lot of crops, so the university has been releasing barley varieties since the 1920s, but over the decades it got a little more specialized, and we've had a couple of famous barley breeders in recent history. The first one that probably really put us on the map was a guy named Brian Harvey, and he was the breeder that was responsible for releasing Harrington, which in the farming community was quite a famous barley variety. It actually put Canada and this particular province on the map in terms of good barley. It really changed the game compared to what was available to growers before that time.
Why is this research and work so important?
It's really relevant because agriculture is obviously a stable backbone of this province. We kind of see the highs and lows with some of the other industries like mining and oil and gas, but agriculture is always there. And probably in the last 20 years, we've been really riding a high in terms of farmers doing a lot better than they probably were off in the 80s. So you're seeing a lot more families coming back to the farm, which has been great. And so the Crop Development Center where I work is really part of our role is to really support the local farm community, but maybe even a little more widely Western Canadian farmers. So myself, I'm responsible for barley and oat breeding, and so that means when I think about what local growers need and the local malting and brewing industry, it means I'm an easily accessible ear that people can come talk to, and so I kind of have these people foremost in my mind when I look at what's needed in varieties.
You mentioned Harrington. What are some of the things that people are using now?
So these days we've got two dominant varieties. One's called CDC Copeland, which came out of our program probably about 20 years ago, and another variety called AC Metcalf, which came from the Brandon breeding program around the same time. So those are the two major varieties that are commonly used. And so most brewers who are using Canadian barley would be having their two-row pale malt made from one of those two varieties. And more typically we hear that Copeland tends to get used a little bit more by the craft brewers. It has a little bit different malting quality profile that tends to be a little more suited for the craft brewers. So when we talk about the different types of barley quality, we can kind of break it into barley that's used for all malt brewing, which is typical of the craft industry, and then adjunct brewing, which is maybe a little more associated with large industrial brewers. So Copeland has sort of what we call a quieter or lower enzymatic activity package, which means that brewers probably have a little more control in the brewing process compared to using something like AC Metcalf.
I guess we should probably back it up a little bit. If you're not a home brewer, when you understand how barley works is the farmer pulls it off the field, the seed is dried, but then it's sent to a malting facility.
That's
where
right.
they treat it with a process of heat, similar to like roasting.
Yes.
And then depending on what they do to it, they can produce different flavors and characteristics. And then they take that malted barley and sell it to the brewers.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah, barley is kind of an interesting crop because the growers have to be a little bit more technically capable, because it's actually the only crop where you have to deliver the seed as a living organism. It still has to germinate. If you're growing wheat or canola, if it's wheat, you're grinding it up to make a flour, and if it's canola, it's being crushed into an oil product. So with barley, that seed has to be delivered alive, and that's, like you say, where the maltster takes over there. And he adds some water to it to get it germinating, puts it under some nice conditions to get some initial growth of that seed, and that's really where that barley grain is transformed into something that the brewer can use. So you start getting some development of enzymes that start breaking down that starch into simple sugars that the yeast can use to make alcohol, and that protein is being broken down into some simple amino acids again for the yeast to be grown. And like you say, the control of flavor is really in that maltster's hands towards the end of that process, which they call kilning. They can do some different things with the heat and produce some darker coloration and some interesting flavors there.
And my favorites are like the dark roasty chocolate malts for stouts.
Absolutely, right? we need to get a few more of these new micro malting, or I should say craft malting businesses that have cropped up on the prairies. A few more of them doing that kind of work, because I agree, that's the interesting malt to see.
When I met you, we were at Maker's Malt in Rostern.
That's right.
Is it Rostern or Rostern?
I say Rostern.
Rostern.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
We were debating that this morning.
It's got that silent H in there, right?
One of the coolest things was we got to chew on some of that barley.
Right.
Unmalted and then malted.
Yeah.
And different levels of malting. So it was really like you could taste that coffee quality coming out of it.
Absolutely.
Or that really fresh, grassy.
Yes, depending on how it was treated.
Is that something you guys think about on your side?
We don't typically get into those sorts of considerations, I guess, because we know the maltsters have a little bit more, well, I should say probably a lot more control over developing those different characteristics. We kind of think as barley as a base, a sort of a blank palette that they can kind of put their stamp on, how they want to change it to meet the needs of their customers. If we try to manipulate the barley too much, sometimes we worried we'd sort of put the maltster into a bit of a corner that they might not be able to work on. So we try to kind of keep it as a general product that works for any type of malt that they want to make.
I remember one of the things you were saying was talking about protein content, protein levels.
Yes.
The percentages. And then when I was talking to farmers after the fact, they were talking about the protein levels and percentages for craft beer.
Right.
Can you kind of break that down?
Sure.
Talk to me like I'm 6.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So, I mean, traditionally barley is bought or not bought more commonly based on its protein content. So the maltsters have a range of protein content that they'd like to see delivered to their facilities. And so typically in Canada, we talk about a range somewhere between 11 to 12.5% protein. And so quite often, barley goes above that 12.5% level, and when that's the case, the maltsters tend not to buy it, so it gets rejected and used for feed typically. But if
which is far less of a premium price.
Absolutely,
You're taking
yeah.
a big hit as
You
a
are
producer.
as a price, yeah. Usually there's a pretty good separation in price there, so that's why barley sometimes is considered a little bit of a risky crop to grow there from that price point of view. But within that protein spectrum, we do have, again, this breaks down into the two sort of quality profiles. The craft brewing industry would tend to take barley or use barley that's in that closer to that 11% level, and those high adjunct brewers would be tending to take barley closer to that 12.5% level there. So there is some range, and so one thing we've really tried to do with our new varieties that we breed is really try to make the tendency to hit that spec for farmers a little bit easier for them, so that maybe it reduces the risk of growing barley a little bit from the past.
What determines protein content?
Partly genetic, so it's partly the variety itself. There will be varieties that tend to be lower protein or tend to be higher, but also the environment. So a growing year where you maybe have a little bit drier conditions towards the end of the growing season would tend to promote higher protein content, and then also the way the farmer handles the barley. So depending on how much fertilizer they put on, row spacing, some other agronomic practices, they can all influence the barley. But really here in Western Canada, when most farmers are under a dry land situation, so they don't have access to irrigation, really moisture or rainfall becomes the biggest variable that is really out of people's control. So farmers tend to look at historical patterns of rainfall in their area and work appropriately off of those numbers.
So I want to take what you said, pull back a bit.
Sure.
I want to impress upon the people the idea that farmers today are not what was happening 30 years ago.
That's right.
They are not screwing around. Like, they have topographical maps. They know where there are like low divots in the soil, high zones. Like they can spec the computer to shoot X amount of seeds in one spot because they know that's a good spot, or a bad spot. They won't shoot as many seeds out through the. They are not just like Johnny Appleseeding this thing. This is like high tech, like drones flying through the fields.
Absolutely.
They're taking soil samples, and like this is some high tech science.
That's right. Yeah, I think as farms have gotten larger, the economic input that farmers are needing to do at the beginning of a season, that overall risk increases. So a year like this, where we had a pretty rough fall, you know, that negative economic hit to their profitability is just that much larger. So they do as much as they can to mitigate those risks, and one way of that is to really get a better picture of how their farm produces whatever crop they're putting on it. So as you say, they have usually they have at least one, if not several, agronomists that they will hire to do an assessment of their farm, monitor it during the year, and they are looking at things like different fertility in different parts of the field, and as you say, that will impact how much fungicide or fertilizer they'll tend to put on certain parts of their field. And yes, the whole idea is to maximize that balance of economic return. So not putting in, like as you say, not putting in too much fertilizer in an area where they know they're not going to get much return on it. So trying to minimize that wastage of upfront costs. Yeah.
What are some of the challenges today for growing barley for craft beer?
I think with craft beer in particular, you know, I would say the craft beer industry is a little bit more forgiving than probably the large industrial brewers. The range of products they're making means that they've got more flexibility, I think, in terms of the malt that they take in. And so in a sense, craft brewers and large brewers face the same risks. So if you have a year like this where it was very dry in parts of the provinces, and then we got into quite cool and wet harvest conditions. The risk there is that you have a lot of chitted or sprouted grain that if it doesn't get used fairly quickly isn't going to make any malt. So you'll see that there's a big rush on right now for a lot of maltsters to try to use that grain right away and get it out to their customers, because if they wait till after Christmas, probably that germination, which is a key characteristic of malt, goes way down. So there's a commonality there, but I think the specs that the craft malting industry is looking for, I think they're a bit more of an easier customer to satisfy, which is it's been a really nice thing to see, I would say, for farmers, especially knowing that if their product isn't exactly bang on in some very tight specs, they still have an opportunity to sell it, what most of them would consider to be a very good product still, to a group of people that can make use of it and turn it into quite a varied number of products, for sure.
So what might have been a loss now is an economic boom.
Exactly, yeah.
By developing something locally, by doing a value add like turning it into beer,
yes,
very, very close to the farmer, they make more money, and more money stays in the province.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's really a nice thing to see more. We always talk in Canada about how we ship so much of our, whether it's grain or forest products, out of the country, and we never really fully take advantage of what we're producing here. And I think that's where this craft brewing change in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been a real positive economic driver in many parts of the prairies and Ontario. We see a lot of that as well. So it's anytime you can tie into the local, if you can make a chain from beginning to end in terms of raw product to finished product, I think that really resonates with people these days.
It reminds me of, and this is going to sound a little bit negative, but it reminds me of a political cartoon I saw back in the day in school. Was a cow was eating in the prairies and being milked in the east.
Right.
And I think that sentiment still resonates a little bit today, even with, or I don't get too much into politics on the podcast, but we see that kind of sentiment, that grievance popping up again. So
yes,
in my mind, it's like, how can we build up the local economy and do something great here?
Absolutely.
And if craft beer is one of those ways, like, why not?
Why not take advantage of that? Absolutely. And it's a nice, you do what you can with the resources you have locally. And I think that's what in many cases, we've missed out on in Canada, is we've sort of lost that a bit for a while. But like you said, we're starting to see a rethinking of that, and this idea that having local skill sets is advantageous. And so with Saskatchewan being such an ag-heavy province, making beer out of local barley makes sense. I'm sure we'll see something in the next number of years in the same vein with marijuana production. It's seen as a way to revitalize rural Canada in many ways. So we'll see if that comes to bear. But I think anytime you're able to produce something and then that key step of then making it into a value-added product is what we've been lacking, and it's good to see it in multiple ways happening these days.
Let's drink some of the fruits of our
right
labors.
on. I thought you wouldn't.
I'm sure indirectly you've been responsible for some of the barley that's gone into this beer.
Hopefully, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, like you were talking about before with Maker's Malt, they've had some interesting promotion of local barley, and some of ours has been part of that, so it's been nice to see.
They're great guys.
Yeah.
I just can't say enough about how much fun I had that day.
Right on.
Yeah, it's just a really great experience. I think if anyone's into craft beer in Saskatchewan, they should visit Rostern and check out Maker's Malt.
It's worth it, yeah, especially when they throw a field day. It's nice to kind of see the barley in the field, so next time you're out driving around the countryside, people might pay a little more attention to what's out the window and ask the question if it is barley and if it's going into their beer.
Cheers.
Right on, cheers. Thanks, Matt.
So this one is called Shalimar.
Okay.
It's based on our Cat's Got the Cream ale, which is one of our most popular seasonal ales. It's designed to be a fall-winter seasonal.
Right on.
You're going to be looking for lots of vanilla, cinnamon, kind of Christmassy style cake spices.
Absolutely. Yep.
And the Shalimar comes from the Shalimar tea we used. So Vanessa, one of our head brewers, she infused a bunch of tea with the beer to lend all those Shalimar black tea characteristics.
Excellent. That is definitely in there. It's got a nice dark color to it as well to go along. Excellent.
Yeah, a little cloudy, I would say, compared to what I would regularly look at the Cat's Got the Cream.
For sure, hey? Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when I think of fall and winter, you know, I used to have a friend that drank a lot of mulled wine, and you know, it's something you would just take in at certain times of the year, and it's nice to see that back into the beer industry where you've got seasonal beers, and especially with us having such long winters here, there's some product that'll have a bit of shelf life for for brewers.
I know you said that you're not a big dark beer drinker, but what are your first impressions on this?
This is nice. I agree. This is definitely a fall winter beer. I would see myself, you know, this would be something I could see having up first when I come into a pub or wherever. This would be a first drink, and then for me, I'd move on to something else. But it's a good starter for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some nice flavors in there. Let kind of linger on the palate too after you've let it rest a while there.
I found when I put my nose in the glass, big vanilla aroma.
Right. Yeah.
But because of the black tea, it has that really characteristic black tea finish.
Absolutely.
Kind of what you describe it, slightly bitter, maybe a little bit of fruit, passion fruit.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
But the vanilla notes definitely come through there.
I think this is like a dessert.
A little bit, eh? A little bit of sweetness there. Yeah, absolutely. A little Christmas cake coming in there.
Yeah. We get that a lot. People say, oh, Christmas. Yeah. Christmas cake. So, yeah.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
So back to barley.
Sure.
What do you think is next for barley in Saskatchewan?
Well, you know, we've got, at least speaking about our program, we do have some new varieties coming out. There's one that we just released last year, 2018, called CDC Churchill. And so we tend to name a lot of our barleys after rivers that flow through either, well, mostly Western Canada, but so this was kind of nice to get one that was directly in Saskatchewan. But this one was actually targeted a little more directly at craft brewers. So it's got a bit of a different malting profile compared to Metcalfe and Copeland, which I mentioned before. So this is a little bit more typical of European barley, European malt barley, which is different than Canadian. So we were trying to aim for these low enzyme levels, yet maintaining sort of this what we call extract, which indicates how much alcohol you can produce from a given amount of malt barley. So it'll be interesting to see if you know, groups like Maker's Malt pick this one up. We have talked to them about it. Red Shed Malting in Alberta, they also have that one on their radar. So I think in a few years' time, when there's a little bit more available from the farming community of that variety, that one will start making its way into the malt plants, and then hopefully into the craft industry here.
Is the thinking that if the barley is more efficient, then you can produce more alcohol, requiring less barley to mean
that's right.
You're making some savings and some efficiencies?
That's the idea, yeah. You should be able to get more bang for your buck when you buy that malt. So I don't know where the economics on that play out with a smaller brewer. That's always been something that's been emphasized with those really large breweries where they're looking for efficiencies in all manner of their system. But I think that the same thinking goes when you think about the craft industry as well. You should be able to make a little bit more beer from the same amount, depending on the style, of course, but from the same amount of malt there. And so it'll also be interesting to see if the craft maltsters can do something interesting with that one in terms of flavor development with kilning, even roasting. Some of the smaller maltsters now have some roasting ability to get into those more chocolate malts that tie into those stouts and more of those winter type beers. Yeah.
Did you ever think that when you got into starting this research that you'd have to learn so much about beer?
It was definitely, when I was going through school, I mean, I always loved beer. I did some of my school in Ontario back in the 90s, and at that time they had already started down that road to sort of a craft brewing community there. So in Waterloo where I was, there's a couple of local brewers that had some interesting beers. So that got my interest in beer, but I didn't know really a lot about how it was made. So yeah, after I went through and learned about what barley was and how to turn that into something good, it's been a lot of fun getting to know the brewing side a little bit more. And I mean, it's still my weakness. I definitely don't have the ins and outs of what it takes to make a great beer, but I have thought about if I ever get a chance to take a sabbatical, it might be a great way to spend a year is learning how to make beer and fill out that side of my knowledge a little more.
Biggest takeaway from you from the last 5-10 years of research, what do you think that the average person needs to know about Saskatchewan barley?
I think what I've said in the past, and I'll say it again here, is that we have for the last at least 40 years have a worldwide reputation of producing good barley. So the barley that we grow in Saskatchewan and in Western Canada in general, yes, it gets used domestically for sure, but it gets exported all around the world, and right now it predominantly gets exported to the US and China. But it is the highest quality barley available in the world, and quite often it gets used to be blended with barleys from other parts of the world to bring up the quality. So it's a strategy brewers will use. They'll buy cheaper barley from elsewhere and then blend it with our barley, which tends to be a little bit more pricey. But it's something that it's not advertised locally. It probably, if you asked people outside of Canada who are in the barley industry, they would know more about Canadian barley than someone who grew up here in Regina or in Saskatoon. But it was strong reputation. It's not going away. And I think it's just one of those things people really need to know about because it's been going on in their backyard, not only the growing, but the science behind producing these varieties for a long time, and it's something I think people here should be proud of, I'd say.
On behalf of the craft beer community and all the happy beer drinkers of our province, thank you to you and your team and all the hardworking farmers of Saskatchewan.
Absolutely, yeah. My pleasure, Matt.
We couldn't make this happen without your guys' hard work.
It's good. It's good to
Aaron, thank you for your time today.
Right on, thanks.
Rebels, thanks for listening today. I'm also proud to let you know that the Rebellion Brewing Podcast is an affiliate member of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. If you're into podcasts or you're looking for great content produced right here in our province, the Sask Podcast Network at saskpodcastnetwork.com is a great one-stop shop for local stories to listen to. I'm going to include some links to Dr. Aaron Beattie's webpage and maybe some social media if he'd like. And you can find out more information about his work and maybe a little bit more craft beer information. As always, if you want to find the latest news about Rebellion Brewing, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Untapped. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.